Hello, and welcome to another edition of Brussels Sprouts. I'm Andrea Kendall-Taylor.
And I'm Jim Townsend.
And we're so glad you could join us. As winter approaches and territorial changes along the front lines in Ukraine remain minimal, the realization is setting in that a long war likely lies ahead and that the challenges facing Ukraine are perhaps greater than the Allies anticipated. To continue to defend itself against Russia's aggression in the months and years to come, Kyiv will need the full support of its Western backers. Yet continued aid from the United States, Ukraine's largest provider of weapons by far, is looking increasingly doubtful. The U.S. Congress has been unable to pass new legislation for Ukraine assistance since September due to opposition from portions of the Republican Party, and there are no signs that this opposition is softening. With every day that passes, the window of opportunity for a course correction is shrinking, and Ukraine will soon feel the consequences if nothing changes. To unpack the political reality around Ukraine's support in the United States and what lies ahead, we're very pleased to welcome Ivo Daalder to the podcast today. Ivo, welcome.
Hey, great to be here.
Ivo is president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and from 2009 to 2013, he served as the United States ambassador to NATO. Ivo, before we hit record, we were all kind of reflecting that things feel gloomy, that the dialogue, the discourse in Washington, but increasingly in European capitals has shifted. It's been a notable shift, I think, in the last couple of weeks. Can you give us your sense of where the narratives are on the U.S. side in terms of where things lie with the war and the potential for sustained U.S. support to Ukraine?
Yeah, I think gloomy is probably the right word to describe what's happening. And by the way, I think there's gloominess in Kyiv as well about what's happening. Just go back just a few months to late spring, early summer, as everyone was gearing up for the Ukrainian counteroffensive. There was this hope and actually even an expectation that the weapons that the Ukrainians had gotten, the training that they had received, and the intelligence support that was being provided, as well as very significant supplies of ammunition, that would be sufficient for the Ukrainians to launch the counteroffensive and to break through in a couple of places, or at least to find a way to threaten Russians' control of the land corridor between Crimea and Russia proper. And that was the strategic objective. And I remember talking to people in the administration saying that, come October, we expect that the Ukrainians are going to be in a very strong position to perhaps start thinking about opening negotiations on the basis of a position of strength. And clearly that was what the Ukrainians were expecting. And they were talking about, we will be in Crimea in October. Well, it's now November. And the front line between the 1,000 kilometer front line between Russia and Ukraine has shifted a total of 500 square kilometers since January 1st. That's what's called a stalemate. And indeed, the Ukrainian head of the armed forces has described it as such. Now, it doesn't mean the fighting has stopped. The fighting is incredibly intense. The number of people being killed and wounded continues to be very, very significant, but the lines aren't moving. And so in Washington, there is an increasing appreciation, I think, inside the administration that the hope and expectation may have been too positive, too forward-leaning, and that we are now in a position where the number one thing the Ukrainians need to do is to maintain the gains they have so far. And that there's a shift in thinking in Washington to, we need to make sure that the Ukrainians dig deep and create the kind of defensive perimeter that Russians have been able to do in order to make sure that the Russians, weak though they are, don't actually break through the Ukrainian lines. And in order to do that, it is incredibly important that the U.S. and its allies continue to provide the ammunition and the equipment, but particularly the ammunition, the missiles, the rockets, the shells, that will allow Ukraine to defend itself. And that's why this question of funding is so critical. Everyone realizes that the U.S. is the crux, it's the leader. Without the U.S., Europe will not be able to fill the gap, even if they would want to, which itself may be a question. And so we're stuck on this question: is the United States going to be prepared to provide the financial means to deliver the kind of equipment and the kind of ammunition and material that the Ukrainians need to defend themselves, not just for a counteroffensive. And that's a big shift in mood.
Yeah, it's a huge shift in mood. And I think you'll hear even people who are very ardent supporters of Ukraine now talking about accepting the prospect that Russia may occupy large swaths of Ukrainian territory for the foreseeable future. And so I think, again, it's a significant shift. But I want to pick up on this point about U.S. funding, because it's kind of, the big question that everyone is watching very closely. And the question is whether or not the U.S. Congress will pass another round of assistance. And you'll hear differing opinions that some say, well, no, it's not looking unlikely, in large part because it's going to be difficult to get the bill to the floor. But if the bill gets to the floor, that there's enough Republican votes that can see it passed. But I think the thing that's gloomy to me in my mind also is, though, that even if this next round of assistance passes, that it very well could be the last one that we see for some time. So I want to get your sense of where things stand on this funding debate, and your sense of whether or not the Congress will be able to pass another round of support.
Well, I think first, just to set where we are on in terms of public and congressional support. There is overwhelming public and overwhelming congressional support for continuing to provide Ukraine with the military assistance it needs.
Ivo, will you give some of the data that you all recently?
Yeah, so I mean, we at the council, the Chicago Council, do polling, and our most recent poll, which was done in September, indicated that public support for continuing military support is at 63%. Now, compare that to November of 2022, it was at 65%. It's gone down 2% over a period of almost a year, and that's within the margin of error. In fact, among Democrats, it's gone up. Among among independents, it's remained relatively stable at kind of 2/3. The problem is among Republicans. There is now a majority of Republicans who would like to stop providing aid to Ukrainians, and that's the first opinion poll we've done, and we've done a whole bunch in which Republican majority no longer supports providing aid. On Capitol Hill, there is overwhelming support among Republicans in the Senate. And indeed, Mitch McConnell, who has emerged throughout the last 20 plus month as one of the staunchest supporters of Ukraine, has pushed very hard for an aid package that includes aid to Ukraine, aid to Israel, aid to Taiwan, and of course also dealing with the issue of the border. And they're working very hard on the Senate to put together a package. The problem is in the House side, and it's on the House Republican side. And the House, as we all know, has not been able to get anything done for the past few months. It didn't have a speaker, wasn't able to do anything for about 3 weeks. It now does have a speaker. It was able to pass a bill that kept the government open just last week, again, with large-scale Democratic support. And the only question is, at what point is a bill that, as you rightly said, at one point is there a bill that includes Ukrainian funding going to come to the floor? The floor in the House is controlled by the Speaker. The Speaker has never voted in favor of Ukrainian aid. But on the other hand, he's also never been supportive of relying on Democratic votes to keep the government open, and he just did that. So I'm remain relatively optimistic that in the not too distant future, between now and say mid-January, when the continuing resolution starts to run out, we will have a vote on Ukrainian aid. I don't think it's not going to happen. What I worry about is not only is that the last vote, and that depends in some ways how big is the package. It needs to be big enough to at least get us past the next election, so it becomes a non-political issue then. But will it contain all the elements that the Biden administration pushed? We spend a lot of time thinking about military aid, and
Yes,
that's critical.
exactly.
Economic aid is equally.
Do you have an understanding what the bill looks like? Because I think as we were saying, I think both of our impressions is that the Biden administration seems optimistic that they can get something passed, perhaps because it's tied to border assistance or something else that Republicans can get behind. But I think the point that you just raised is, about the size and the substance of the bill and whether or not it's enough to get through 2024. I don't have a sense of actually what's in the bill, and I wonder if you have any insight.
So I don't think there's a bill yet, and so it's hard to know what's in it. But I think the discussion among Republicans and Democrats in the Senate and the White House, which is really where I think now the focus is, although White House is continuing to have conversations with the House, but the focus is really on the Senate. The discussion there is that there's no question that the amount of military aid will be at least as much as Biden had asked for. And I wouldn't be surprised if it's more. Remember that every time Biden put anything on the table, Congress did more. The big debate is on economic aid. And in particular, the 14.3 billion in direct budgetary support that the administration has put on the table. This budgetary support has been absolutely vital for Ukraine to maintain its economy. And remember, even if it has a military, if its economy is not working, the country collapses too. And Russia doesn't care how it collapses. And indeed, it's targeting and will soon increase the targeting of its economic infrastructure precisely for that reason. There is an argument in the Senate, well, the Europeans should take care of that. And yes, in theory, the Europeans should provide the economic aid. But anybody who knows how the European Union works knows that that is not going to be forthcoming for a bit. The European Union has put on the table a package of 50 billion euros over the next 4 years. That package is stuck because of a variety of domestic and other reasons, including what's happening in Germany in the budget debate, which we don't have to get into. But as far as I can tell, Treasury and other officials are saying if this money is not part of the Ukrainian budget, the Ukrainian economy is going to go under. And Europe is not going to be able to go to
paying your fighters, your doctors, your trash collection. I mean, I think it gets so overlooked that you can maintain the front line and everything crumbles behind it. And then that's it. I mean, it's really critically important.
No, that's exactly right. So, and there is a worry that the Senate, not focused on this, will do what it needs to do on the military side, but not on the economic side. And you can guarantee that if it doesn't get into the Senate bill, it certainly won't get into the House bill. And so it really is critical that it gets in the bill. And I think I think part of it is starting to make the argument why this is important. We can actually lose this war. The Ukrainians can lose this war in a very, very real sense. If they can't defend themselves military and their economy is not able to sustain itself, it will collapse. And if it collapses, the Russians win. And that is what this is about. And that's what President Biden wrote in his op-ed in the Washington Post over the weekend. But I think it needs to become part of the argument. I think we've all been in some ways felt that things were getting so good and so positive over the last year or so since the resistance in Kyiv and then the counteroffensive in August and in Kherson and Kharkiv, that we thought this war was going to win. And indeed, the Washington debate is about whether to provide enough weapons for Ukraine to win. I don't think that's the debate. The debate is, are we going to do enough for Ukraine not to lose? And I think that's, talk about gloomy. That's where we are, and we better be very serious about it.
Well, that's just it equals what I've been hearing as well. The gloom there from Chicago is, I think, is felt around here, and I think allies are beginning to wake up to that too. A number of allied delegations have come through and are hearing this gloom, and they've been saying, at least in Europe, it's not quite as gloomy, but they return back to their home base, and I think that we're starting to see a real turn of the tide there, and discussions in governments about, so what do we do if this happens? What's the European response? How can we step up? What do we need to be doing now? That's beginning to be part of the conversation. But Ivo, let me ask you a question about the summit coming up. You and I have been to many of them. My first one actually was the 50th anniversary in 1999. And I got to watch this town become a big summit town. But as we, in the run up to the summit, and as we know, that's the most important thing in a lot of ways, is putting together what we're going to do in Washington. 75th anniversary. It's going to be a few days before the Republican National Convention as well. This town will be just consumed with the politics of it. And so, as we describe for us, in your view, what the run up to the summit could look like in terms of preparations for what's going to be a very big political event. And particularly when it comes to Ukraine membership in NATO. We saw what happened in Vilnius. It wasn't pretty. We know the administration does not want Ukraine to be on the agenda. That's not for Washington. But there's a view out there that that's not going to be easy to keep it in a box. So tell us, from your experience, what's the run up to the July summit look like? What's going to be happening at NATO, and how are they going to deal with this question about Ukraine membership? Just from journalists who are going to ask the president, hey, President Biden, what about membership in NATO for Ukraine?
So I think this is critical, and in fact, the discussion we've had up to this point makes it even more critical.
Right.
As you know, I've long argued that this is not a war over territory. It's a war over who controls the future of Ukraine. And the only way Russia is defeated is if Ukraine can decide its own future in its own way and guarantee that whatever decision it makes, it can execute and defy whatever the Russians want. And I believe the only way that's possible, and certainly the Ukrainians believe the only way that's possible, is that they are fully integrated into the West.
Right.
Integrated into the West as a member of the European Union, and integrated into the West as a member of NATO. And the question has never been whether that's the right approach. And indeed, at Vilnius, there was movement on that with regard to NATO. I don't read Vilnius in the same way as many people do. I think Vilnius was actually a very good step forward on bringing Ukraine into this larger path and of becoming a member of NATO. It's not only said that they will become members of NATO, it also said that Ukraine's future is in NATO. And of course, it eliminated some of the more laborious steps for Ukraine to become a member, including the need to go through a membership action plan. So now that we are faced with a stalemate, which I think we are, and we may not like to call it, but that's what it is, and we're faced with the reality that Russian troops will continue to occupy Ukrainian territory, which, by the way, they have occupied since 2014, so it's not like it's new. And it's not like if we were to go back to where the line was on February 24th, 2022, that all of a sudden we had reached nirvana. It wasn't nirvana then. That this war has been going on, but understanding that the rest of that territory is fully and completely integrated into the West, and so I actually think the administration understands this. And yes, you're right, Jim, that particularly in the White House and particularly in the Oval Office, there is skepticism about when Ukraine becomes a member of NATO, because bringing a member that is at war with contested borders into the alliance raises all kinds of prickly questions.
And with EU accession too, we can come back to that. So it's for both. It's for both.
No, exactly. And so I think there remains deep skepticism, and this is not a skepticism that sometimes gets blamed on the National Security Advisor or the NSC. This is a skepticism from the president, and he is the most skeptical of all. As George Marshall said to Harry Truman over the question of whether to recognize Israel or not, "Thank you, Mr. President, for reminding me who's the person who was elected." He was elected, so it is in that sense he's a pretty important voice in this issue. But they are thinking, and I think they need to think about how do you start this process. And the Washington debate about invitations and path to membership and all this stuff, I think, is completely wrong, because it doesn't actually understand how you get there. Ask Sweden how easy it is to get into NATO,
right?
When you're not at war, and when the strategic case is as unambiguous as Sweden. So the idea that you have an invitation doesn't mean, and that somehow you solve that problem, was wrong for Vilnius, and it's wrong for Washington. The question is, what are you willing to do between now and then?
Right.
The moment. And I think this is a serious discussion that, of course, was missed in Vilnius. The G7 debate on the long-term, the G7 decision on the long-term security commitments in terms of guaranteeing defense and other equipment and capabilities for Ukraine to defend itself was a central part of starting to reassure the Ukrainians between now and then. The French are actively engaged in an MOU, which they think they will sign soon. The U.S. is actively negotiating. They're actually thinking about, can we make this perhaps more legally binding, and find a way for the Senate to endorse it as a treaty, and what kind of guarantees can you put in there? Is it just equipment?
Is it material? Yeah. Can you say more about that? Because, I mean, if the Congress can't pass a bill to provide security assistance to Ukraine, how do we think that? I guess chart that out for me, because I feel especially gloomy, because I agree with you that the prospect of moving closer to membership is not pragmatic. It's not practical. It's not happening in the near term. But I also had a sense that some of this discussion about long-term security guarantees had fallen away. And maybe that's because we've got the war in Israel, and a lot of bandwidth and effort and attention is being directed in that direction. But I've kind of lost the thread on this discussion and had this maybe incorrect assumption that if we couldn't pass security assistance for Ukraine, that some sort of long-term commitment that would enable Ukraine to do the appropriate planning and everything that it needs to do to adequately defend itself was also equally unrealistic. But maybe that's not right.
It is. But if you accept that there won't be any more security assistance to Ukraine, we're also accepting that Russia's going to win this war.
Yeah.
And so I don't think that that's where we ultimately will end up, which is why at its core, I remain an optimist about the continuing support, at least until the election. Don't ask me about post-2024. Because that's a whole other kettle of fish. But I think between now and then, and so a commitment, by the way, legally binding commitment, doesn't require a House vote. It only requires 67 votes in the Senate if it's a treaty. And I think part of that, and certainly the argument I'm making, is it's not enough just to do material and intelligence and training support. I actually think it needs to open up the possibility of direct support. And yes, not Article 5, but there's a whole bunch of other Article 5s and kinds of commitments that are out there. And, I've often pointed out that our bilateral security commitment to the Japanese solves two issues. One, the issue of how far does it extend? The Japanese commitment does not extend to territories that Japan does not control, or it says administered, which includes the four islands up in the Northern Territories, which have been occupied by the Soviet Union and now by Russia since the end of World War II. And so Article 5, the security commitment to Japan, does not apply to that territory. And you can do the same with Ukraine, that Article 5 or whatever, this security guarantee does not apply to the parts of the country that it does not control. Secondly, if you look at what Article 5 says in not only with Japan, but with the Philippines and Korea, and indeed the kind of agreements that we negotiated in CETO and the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, which is Moribund, it says that an attack against the territory will, is of interest. But the other thing that it said, it relates to what Article 5 actually promises. It says that an attack against the territory of Japan is of interest, of security interest of the United States, and that the U.S. will, quote, act to meet the common danger. Don't say how. Could be sanctions. Could be a UN resolution. And it could be airplanes to bomb the bejesus out of the person who's attacking you. And so you would have to work out with the Ukrainians what it means. But that strategic ambiguity in your deterrent threat, which is, by the way, one of the things we've had as a core in how to think about defending Taiwan, is something that could apply for Ukraine in the interim as you move through the steps of both eventual NATO and eventual EU membership for Ukraine.
Yeah, you've been such an important voice on this. And I know these are ideas you've put out a long time ago. And, even in our transatlantic forum on Russia, I think you had such a wonderful reception to those types of ideas that you put on the table. But what has the reception been since then? And I don't, where do you think we are in this discussion? Do you think those ideas are gaining any traction? Is it increasingly looking more viable that that's where we're going to end up? Or I'm really curious about how those ideas are being received and digested.
I think there's a serious willingness to look at how to do this. And I think we missed, we all missed the opportunity in Vilnius to lay the foundation for it. As you remember, before Vilnius, I said we should have had a group of experts that looked at how you do this and put it together. And instead, we and the Ukrainians went for something that was never going to happen.
Yeah.
The argument that it needed an invitation was an argument that has no political reality attached to it. It means nothing. And in fact, it enhances the vulnerability of the Ukrainians. What they really need is a pathway to NATO membership that includes the steps that are necessary that can be implemented soon, if not immediately. And so I think the administration understands that. I think they are willing to take a serious look at it. What they don't want, and frankly, which I don't think other countries want either, is to be caught in a binding legal commitment that they're not always willing to fulfill. And part of that is on the security assurances, on the security support side. Will they always have the funding to be able to make it happen? Remember the Israel in 2016, the deal that the Obama administration had with Israel also came with a guaranteed $30 billion plus, it was $35 billion plus package that guaranteed the funding. And so you would have to do the same thing if this was going to work out with the Ukrainians. And given the climate that we talked about at the beginning of the show, that's hard. But I think there's 67 votes in the Senate for this. I think there's 67 votes for NATO membership for Ukraine. The problem is I don't think there are 31 NATO members who are willing to move in that direction either at the moment, nor is the administration there. So that's I think there is. I think the administration is open to thinking about these things, and I think we all would do well to think practically about how do we advance that kind of practical, real agenda, as opposed to calling for things that won't happen. And if they were to happen, change nothing.
Yeah, no, that's right. Well, I have one more summit question for you. And this is to talk about the new section.
Wait, can we wait, Jim? Can we go there at the very end, maybe? Because I want to stick on this like Ukraine thing for one more second. I promise we'll ask about the section.
Okay. Just this once. This once.
Okay. But because it directly follows from what we're talking about in the sense of this new reality is set in. And so people are thinking, well, what do we do now? Is it your sense that the White House, the Biden administration actually has a theory of the case and is thinking about how we might have to redefine victory in Ukraine? I know everyone asks this is how does this end? But I think the really hard part is it feels like we're worse off now because from Moscow's perspective, they see the troubles in the US Congress. They are waiting for the election of President Trump. The Ukrainians are now exhausted and don't have any additional offensive capability for the time being. And so, the theory I had heard for so long from the Biden administration is we need to do what we need to do to put Ukraine in the best possible position on the battlefield so that they're in the best possible position in the negotiating table. I don't think that's where we are. And I don't know how we get back there. And so, how this ends question is still there, but I feel like we're almost worse off now than we were, 4 months ago.
Well, we're worse off now than when we thought 4 months ago that we would be in a different situation than we are today. But so did everybody else, including the Russians for that matter. Frankly, I was never convinced by the argument that if they had had a successful counteroffensive, that would lead to a negotiation. I don't think this war is going to end anytime soon. I don't think there's going to be a negotiation anytime soon. Number one, and Andrea, you know this better than anybody else, Vladimir Putin is not going to negotiate anything until he knows what's happening in 2024 in the United States, because he hopes that Donald Trump's going to solve his problem. And so there is no way he will do anything other than declare victory with real in between. Nor are the Ukrainians going to negotiate anything. They're not able to negotiate anything. So this idea that somehow, you read this, I guess it was Richard Haas and Charlie Kupchan in Foreign Affairs a couple of days ago, that there's a stalemate, let's have a negotiation. Well, just because there's a stalemate doesn't mean you get a negotiation. Ask the Syrians and the Israelis who've been, quote, in this stalemate since 1973, how that peace negotiation over the Golan Heights is going. Sometimes there is no negotiation, or there is a negotiation that doesn't end. I think you're much more likely to have a fluid, frozen conflict if you can have, something like that. Then the Russian forces are going to be occupying major parts of Ukrainian territory for an extended period of time, just as they have in the last 10 years. And the question, it seems to me, is what can you work out with the Ukrainians that ensures that the rest of the territory that it controls and it administers can be reconstructed, revitalized, and is protected against Russian attack.
Which takes us back to NATO membership and the EU.
Which takes you back. And so I actually think that this idea, which has dominated for 20 years, right, or 20 months, that you either win the war or you negotiate a peace, was never realistic. They were never going to win the war. And I disagree with those that say that if we only had given them more ATACMS, they would have won the war. I just disagree with that. But history will make that judgment. But we were never going to negotiate a peace. What we were going to do is to create a situation in which the overwhelmingly large part of Ukraine is part of the West, which then lays the foundation for solving the conflict in the long term. And that requires change in Russia. It requires all kinds of things that will happen over the long term. But, the Baltic states were part of the Soviet Union for 50 years. And after 50 years, they became independent. And they're now members of the European Union and NATO. And at one day, Crimea and the Donbass will be part of the NATO and the EU. It just is not likely to happen tomorrow, or indeed next year or the year after that.
I think that's right.
Right before, Jim, we get to your last question. So, I mean, you framed it perfectly. And so the focus, as you've rightly pointed out, does have to be on the long-term security guarantees. And we've also recognized the challenges that we have in Washington to getting there. So I want to not, again, I feel like really I'm just such a Debbie Downer asking about all of the barriers and obstacles. But I know, Ivo, you had mentioned in a previous conversation, again, more polling that you all had done looking at the Republican Party and this more kind of isolationist undercurrent. And I was really struck by the polling figures that you gave. I think you had said, and you can give the actual figures, it was the first time that more Republicans preferred the US to do less internationally. Yeah. Something
That's
like
right. I mean, so we've done this question since 1974, and Gallup has done it since 1947, which is, do you think the United States should play an active role in world affairs, or do you think the United States should stay out of world affairs? In the last 50 years, 2 to 1, about, mid 60% say active role and about 30% say inactive role. It's now down to, don't quote me on it, I think it's to the high 50s. It's been there before, but the striking thing is that for the first time, a majority of Republicans, 53%, say that the United States should stay out of world affairs.
I think that's such an important message.
And so you do have a breakdown in for the first time in the fundamental American consensus about its role in the world. And this is the dominance of Donald Trump and the party and the America First and isolationist. America First and isolationist is really both. This is not an activist foreign policy that these people want, and that Trump wants. And that's a reality. I think that's going to be one of the reasons why a lot of allies are looking at the United States and wondering whether what they have relied on for 80 years is something they can continue to rely on. As Jim Lindsay and I wrote 5 years ago, in a book called The Empty Throne, the throne was empty, and Biden brought it back, and he brought American leadership back. But there is this question: was this the last breath? And it's not just Ukraine's future; it's a future of a lot of other things that are at stake here. But that's a larger discussion, I think, within the confines of where we are for the next 24 months, next 12 months between now and the end of the election. I think the administration is going to try to do as much as it can to ensure that Russia cannot and does not outlast Ukraine and the West, and cannot succeed.
Last question, Jim, and then you can ask, and then I'm going to be quiet for the rest of the podcast, and you can do all your. Go ahead, two finger. Go ahead.
No. I was going to say I'm going to ask two questions now, not just one, but two.
You can ask as many as we have time for. Last question from Ivo is: how do you think the crises in the Middle East, the Hamas attack, has? I mean, I assume that those questions were asked before the Hamas attack on Israel. And do you think that having these multiple crises is making Americans even less inclined to participate on the global stage, or feeling like the United States is overstretched and not able to do multiple things at multiple times? I mean, that's one thing we haven't talked about in the course of this conversation, is how this Middle East issue is affecting the U.S. capacity and calculus on Ukraine. What's your sense of that?
So yeah, the poll was done before, before October 7th. So I don't know how it plays out in the public, but my guess, and given how polling has evolved, is that every event in the world is seen through the lenses that are reflected in that opinion poll. And so I think it will just lead those who believe that the United States is overstretched and should spend more time at home to say, well, see, proves it. We got another crisis. Let's forget it. We can't do all these things. Let's just build a bigger wall and stay inside. And those who say, no, actually, the United States is the only country in the world that can bring together the international community and to start addressing these kinds of things, we'll be reinforced in that point of view. And, I mean, it depends. There are those of us, I'm one of them, who think that Biden has had, in some ways, the best 5 weeks of his presidency. And there are others who say that it just demonstrates that it was the worst 5, how bad he is. And that's not going to change. So I don't think it just reinforces priorly held beliefs. I don't think it fundamentally changes the picture.
The podcast floor is yours, Jim.
Well, thank you. We've got 30 seconds left. And so she's run down the clock on me. But no. Ivo, just on the polling, I know this was done before Gaza, but one thing that the Gaza crisis has shown is a big generational difference between younger people and those of us who, came of age in the 20th century and with all those crises. That there was a bit of a surprise on the way the younger generation looks on assistance to Israel or Israel's role in the Middle East, et cetera. In your polling, have you found other areas where there's a potential generational divide? Are there other questions that were asked where there was a pretty big difference between how the younger generations look at things versus all of us coming out of the last century?
Yeah, so there's always a generational divide. And there's been for decades and decades and decades. So there was a generational divide during the Vietnam War,
right?
Between younger and older folks. So that's always there. Yeah. What we've seen up to this point is that as the younger generation gets older, it starts to reflect what its previous older generation thought as well. Yeah, there's a secular shift over time, but I think there's an op-ed in the Washington Post. I didn't read it, but the title said, "When I was 33, I knew everything, and when I'm 69 now, and I know one important thing," and that's true. But how much I don't know, right? In some way. So people with strong opinions tend to be young, because that's how it works. The question that we are looking at, and we're getting more and more data on it over time, is, okay, but has there really been a secular shift? And if you look at our generation, which grew up during the Cold War when and understood some sort of fundamental realities, and in my case, our parents' generation grew up during, my parents were kids during World War II. In Europe, and my mother is a survivor of the Holocaust. That has been how I think about it. If you look at this generation, that basically has seen for the last 30 years incredible failure on the part of the United States. 2 wars it's lost, a financial crisis, screwed up on COVID, and that's not the generation that you and I grew up with,
right?
Let alone our parents. And so, how is that going to affect their view about how to deal with the issues writ large? And the Israel question is just I remember the 1973 war. I remember the 1967 war. And so this was real. This was existential. Israel was the weaker party. But that hasn't been the case the last 30 years. And so, I see it with my own kids. They look at the world in a different way because they're influenced by different things. And I do think that we're likely to see that reflecting in how attitudes over time change, but they don't change that quickly. But that's how I think about it.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. And I think your polling is so important, and I really appreciate you all doing that every year. It's really helpful. Last question, I think, and Andrea, thank you for your patience for letting me ask the last question. And this is one, Ivo, that everyone's asking, and that is the next SecGen. Any horses you want to put money on, or any advice you want to give the Alliance in terms of looking at that next SecGen? Any candidates that you are interested in?
Well, there was overwhelming support last time around when they were trying to get somebody in head of Vilnius,
right?
For Mark Rutte, the Dutch Prime Minister, who Biden asked, Johnson asked. I think it was Johnson still. Was it Sunak already? I don't remember. Anyway, the Brits and the French and the Germans and the U.S. were all in favor of Rutte, and Rutte said no. Repeatedly. He is now, since then, two things happened. The Dutch government fell, and there's actually an election this week. And Mark Rutte is no longer the head of the party.
Yeah.
And secondly, he has now said publicly that he is interested in the job. And so, do I know? I don't. Who's going to be, but you have someone who has a lot of support among the major powers, who is the most senior statesperson in Europe, still very young, well liked by a lot of people. So I think he's the front runner. Now, does that mean he's going to get the job? Probably.
Yeah, no, that's right. But I think there will be some disappointment in corners of the alliance that we're hoping a woman or someone from the so-called new allies would get a shot. But I guess because what you said is very compelling, and if that comes to pass, I guess I'll have to wait till the next round.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is, and there would be an interest. I know there is an interest in Washington, of course, in having a woman. There isn't anybody else who has emerged since Vilnius. Rutte is the only one, frankly, who has emerged. Pedro Sanchez could have emerged, but he's just been reelected, or at least he's got another term as prime minister. And there's no other woman who would be available. The only exception being Ursula von der Leyen.
Yeah.
But she is likely to be the candidate of the European political party, and my view on this is strongly held view is it is in the fundamental interest of the United States to have Ursula von der Leyen as the president of the European Commission.
And isn't there Kaja Kallas, the Estonian prime minister, former prime minister?
Yeah, but remember, she was also candidate last time, and she didn't make it.
Yeah.
And I think she didn't make it because I don't think that the U.S. or Germany is prepared to have a Baltic Secretary General. It's nothing about Kallas. It's about that. So.
Well, this was wonderful, Ivo. Thank you so much for doing it, and looking forward to the next time we can sit down. Hopefully we'll have some slightly more optimistic things to talk about. But although I mean, yep, there's a different reality set in, but there is a path forward. And I think you framed up that discussion in such a productive and constructive way. So hopefully that's the path that people are headed down, and that it starts to gain some more momentum. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you.
I appreciate that. Great to chat. And yes, I think my former mayor, stealing from a former British prime minister, said, "Never let a crisis go to waste."
Right.
That's Rahm Emanuel and Winston Churchill, to just put it on there. And I think, there is the gloom that we're seeing does lead to an opportunity for a new strategy. And that new strategy is
that's uncomfortable, and we just have to work through it until there's a new kind of vision. Yeah.
Yeah. And that vision is about what we all know is the answer. And the answer is the integration of Ukraine into the West. And so let's focus on that and figure out how to do it. And let's not do it with slogans, but do it in a real way.
Right. There you go. We ended on a bright note, and I always appreciate that. So thanks, Ivo.
All right.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Brussels Sprouts, brought to you by the Transatlantic Security Team at the Center for a New American Security. You can find all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts. And please remember to rate and review Brussels Sprouts so that new listeners are able to find the show.